It's news review time. Stay tuned. Now, Russia is saying that Ukrainian forces keep shelling the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in southern Ukraine, warning of a nuclear disaster.
The Kiev regime continued its provocations aimed at the creation of a man-made disaster at Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. On November 21st, the Ukrainian artillery fired 8 large-caliber projectiles targeting plant's industrial zone.
The Russian Defense Ministry spokesman says that the plant was shelled from a settlement in the Dnipropetrovsk region controlled by Ukrainian forces. The revelation came just days after similar strikes caused widespread damage to Europe's biggest nuclear plant. Kiev and Moscow have been accusing each other for shelling. Meantime, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency has condemned the attack, saying that it risks a major humanitarian disaster. In a statement, Rafael Grossi also called for a safe zone around the plant, but Moscow says there is no substantial progress toward creating such a zone. Let me now invite our correspondent and an expert to get some insight on this. So, John Emitter joining me from Donetsk, and Marcus Papadopoulos, historian, political analyst, and author, joining me from London. Good to see you both. Now, Johnny, tell us, bring us an update on the news regarding the battlefield and what's going on. And we were waiting for an escalation. You said that both sides are mobilizing their troops, and we are waiting for an offensive on the part of Russia. And we know about the blockade. I'll ask you also another question later on.
Well, let me first of all address this, the attack on the nuclear power station. The most likely culprit, of course, for this is Ukraine. It's difficult to see why Russia would bomb a nuclear power plant in its own territory. So that begs the question of who is giving the orders to fire missiles at this nuclear power plant. Of course, NATO has huge power, influence, you could even say control over Ukraine. It funds it, it arms it. If NATO is to withdraw that support, Ukraine would be forced to negotiate, and frankly, its economy would crumble. But is it in NATO's interest to blow up a nuclear power station? Of course, it would cause huge problems for the Russians. But also, I'm sure many European countries would not want such a humanitarian or environmental catastrophe happening in Europe. But I'm particularly concerned about the extremist elements within Ukraine. We're increasingly seeing videos of some Ukrainian soldiers executing Russian POWs. Frankly, all armies, or most armies, commit war crimes. Only extremists film themselves doing it and then publish them. I reported in Syria. I sat through many hours of ISIS torture videos and execution videos, and some of these videos coming out of Ukraine remind me of that. Of course, NATO countries are fueling this extremist problem. Every journalist in West Ukraine knows full well that there is a major extremist problem in Ukraine. It's not if they do, it's just how strong it is and whether it reaches into the higher echelons of Ukrainian government. So that's a particularly concerning element for myself, that the longer this war goes on, the more likely it is that these extremist elements may well cause more problems. Of course, we had the recent situation in Poland where 2 missiles landed in Poland. NATO was reasonably quick to say that these were Ukrainian missiles, not Russian missiles. But even after that, President Zelensky continued to say that these were Russian missiles that landed in Poland. Many people in Ukraine, particularly extremists, want to bring NATO into this war even more than they are, which could, of course, lead to world war, nuclear war. Right. So NATO started to criticize the Zelensky government after that. So that's one thing I'm particularly concerned with.
Okay. Marcus, that's the problem that John is talking about. Each side, each belligerent side, blaming the other one for this. And it's a nuclear power plant, and it's a big one. And it doesn't matter who hits it. It will create a big humanitarian disaster. So who's responsible for this?
Well, I believe that this matter should be referred to the United Nations Security Council. After all, the United Nations Security Council exists in part to discuss and investigate matters of immense importance. However, the Americans and the British have blocked all attempts by the Russians and also the Chinese to allow the United Nations Security Council to investigate the situation at the nuclear power plant in the Zaporozhye Oblast. It is fair to say that Europe is teetering on the edge of a nuclear disaster because of the indefensible, despicable, and unforgivable actions of the Ukrainian army in relation to the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Whatever your stance is on the war in Ukraine, be it you sympathize with the Western installed and controlled puppet government in Kiev, or if your sympathies lie with the Russian government, there is no justification for the shelling of a nuclear power plant. Because if a nuclear power plant goes up in flames, then that will be a catastrophe for mankind. And for the Ukrainian government and its patrons in the West, along with Western mainstream media, to claim that the Russian army is shelling the nuclear power plant in Zaporozhye is really absurdity at its most absurd. Why? Because the Russian army controls the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. And secondly, how on earth is it in the interests of the Russian government to cause an explosion at a nuclear power plant, which would have devastating consequences for Russian lands and for the Russian population? And on the matter of the NATO, say this: the Ukrainian government is comprised of individuals who are the heirs to the Organization for Ukrainian Nationalists and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, an organization and an army which, during the Second World War, massacred tens of thousands of Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, Belorussians, and Jews. Indeed, if you do not wish to take my word for it, then I urge people watching this interview to contact Yad Vashem in Israel or the Simon Wiesenthal Centre in Israel, and they themselves will corroborate what I am saying about the Organization for Ukrainian Nationalists and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. It is absolutely stomach-turning to see the black and red flag of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army being flown in Kiev and other Ukrainian cities, and Western mainstream media is more than happy to give coverage to that.
Okay. Now, Marcus, we're running out, and let me just ask Johnny Miller a brief question regarding the situation of power outages there. It looks like that Ukraine, instead of weaponry, they now need generators instead.
Well, yes, many people were confused why Russia didn't start hitting this energy infrastructure from the beginning of the war in February, but now they certainly are and have been doing it for the last few weeks. Increasing reports in Ukrainian cities of blackouts across the country. Russia is trying to force the Ukrainian government to the negotiating table by making it very difficult for them to even run as a viable state or look after its own people. One Ukrainian officials advised Ukrainians to leave the country for winter, although the problem with that is that anyone of military age isn't allowed to leave the country. But it looks increasingly likely, as the other guest is saying, that the Ukrainian government is becoming increasingly a totalitarian government. It's able to exert huge control over its population. So really Russia, this destruction of energy infrastructure, even the Russians are thinking this may well not be enough, and they're going to have to have more success on the battlefield. But these 300,000 mobilized troops should be coming to the front lines soon, and we'll wait to see with what the Russians are going to do with them.
Okay, thank you so much for that. John Miller, our correspondent, Donetsk, Marcus Papadopoulos, historian, political analyst, and author in London. Thank you for watching this episode of the News Review on Press TV.